Now, as we continue our commemoration of the tragic events that took place 8 years ago at Marikana, we look at the long road to achieve justice and accountability. 5 years since the release of the Marikana Commission of Inquiry report, chaired by retired Judge Ian Farlam, we still seem no closer to achieving an outcome. And with widows and families of the deceased and those who survived still in legal battles for compensation, what has happened since then? Now, joining us to talk about this is independent researcher and writer David Bruce, who specializes in policing and public security and was a member of the Marikana Panel of Experts. Oh, David, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. I mean, ultimately, there are strikers being prosecuted. We've also seen that there's a process regarding police responsibility based on a submission by IPID. What is the status of that? Ultimately, what is the biggest obstacles emerging from that?
Right. Well, there's Marikana, from a prosecutorial point of view and an investigative point of view, is probably a formidably complex case. There's sort of broadly two episodes of, if we're focusing just on the 16th, that is, because there are, I think it's 5 police officers who are being prosecuted in relation to some killings that took place on the 13th during the course of a clash in which, in fact, 2 police were killed and 3 strikers were killed. But in respect of the 34 people who were killed, and as one of your interviews mentioned, there were a large number of people who were also very seriously injured on the 16th. There's essentially been basically that nothing that has happened in terms of instituting prosecutions against anyone. And part of this is clearly the fact that the case is formidably complex. So if you're just looking at what's known as Scene 1, which is the incident that people are generally fairly familiar with, where there were a group of strikers approaching the police and the police opened fire on them. There you have something like 48 police opening fire on this group of miners. And the legal issues there get really intricate, because there's a doctrine which is known as the doctrine of putative self-defense, where even if the strikers weren't in fact attacking the police, if the police reasonably believed that they were being attacked at that point, then in law that would be regarded as a justified use of force. And so it's only, the question comes in as, at a certain point, the commission at least argued that after about 4 seconds or so, it was clear that there was no, there was no one moving towards the police, and police went on firing into this group of miners. And so the commission suggested that possibly police who went on firing after that point would be guilty of an offense. And so, what I've just sketched out there is, some of the complexities of trying to prosecute an incident of that kind. So one can imagine that it gets, I think I should just stress that I've only begun to sketch out the complexities of trying to prosecute that incident. But, I think I've given you an idea of how difficult it is.
Now, David, one of the other obstacles appears to be that there was supposed to be a reconstruction of Scene 2 with the forensic as well as ballistic experts. I mean, IPID has come out to complain and say that it doesn't have funds for this. I mean, what is the progress on that regard?
Well, I must admit that I simply don't know that, the last the last information about this was about 2 years ago, and it was simply that IPID maintained that they couldn't finance this reconstruction. And I mean, it should also be emphasized that, if anything, the most blatant and overt violations of the law by individual police officers are likely to have taken place at this other scene, which is known as Scene 2. So, the issue of reconstructing that scene and getting to the bottom of what happened there should actually be regarded as a priority.
Well, David Bruce, we're going to continue the conversation on the other side of this. Of course, policing and David Bruce chatting about policing and commissions at large just related to the Marikana massacre, which answers and questions are still being asked and awaited. On the other side of this, we continue with that chat. While you're watching Weekend Dawn, we continue with our conversation. Just before the outbreak, we had spoken to independent researcher and writer David Bruce, who specializes in policing and public security. He was also a member of the Marikana Panel of Experts, obviously just unpacking the Marikana Commission recommendations. David, just looking at the broader issue of policing in South Africa and ultimately the recommendations from the Marikana Commission, I mean, what's emerged on that front?
Right, okay. Well, there again, there's sort of very little has emerged. What we had was a commission process, and in addition to, trying to unpack as clearly as possible what had happened at Marikana, what the commission also identified was a number of problems with policing in South Africa. And what it recommended was that a panel of experts be appointed to look into these issues and to make recommendations on how to address them. So that panel was appointed in 2016 and submitted its report to the minister in 2018 in July. And basically since then nothing has happened with that report. So it seems that there is some kind of unwillingness or lack of interest on the part of government in engaging with the recommendations of that report. And so that report, at the heart of that report, is the issue of professionalizing and demilitarizing the police in South Africa. And up to this point, there hasn't really been any engagement by government with those issues.
I'm also just looking at some of the adjustments that have been made to the report. I mean, what's emerged on that front, just perhaps regarding tactical unit usages, the use of R5s, etc.?
Well, you see, I mean, there have been some small adjustments that have been made. So one of the things was that prior to the Marikana incident, there was quite a lot of these use of these units like the TRT, the Tactical Response Team and the National Intervention Unit in crowd management. And those units were the units which in many ways were the units that were worst implicated in the killings at Marikana. And so there is much more, seems to be a reluctance to make use of those kind of units very overtly in crowd management operations these days. Generally, it isn't true that R5s were generally being used in public order operations prior to Marikana. But there is also just more of an awareness about avoiding the use of these weapons. But there isn't anything that's, around that point. For instance, there's no regulation or anything that's been developed, even though it was one of the issues that was emphasized most strongly in the Marikana Commission process, that this, essentially the use of these weapons should be forbidden in crowd management. But, the SAPS, for instance, hasn't adapted its regulations in that regard, and so on. So the adjustments, it is true to say that there have been some, there have been some adjustments in practice. But, there isn't really anything, to a large degree, you could say, that the SAPS has continued to act largely as if Marikana is something that never happened.
David, just in conclusion, at the beginning of my introducing you, I mean, obviously we were asking about, how long it will take for policing forces to be held responsible, for justice to be served, as well as also for the reformation of some of the systems, where it comes to excessive use of force. What does that look like? What does that timeline look like, as families, as the country waits with bated breath 8 years on?
No, you see, I mean, the basic point is that, the Marikana is something that to some degree has been forgotten. Government, hasn't prioritized addressing the legacy of Marikana. And the police, particularly if you think about it, at the time, the response of National Commissioner Piega was to say that this represents the best of possible policing. So throughout the period that the commission was in progress, the SAPS maintained that it had done nothing wrong at Marikana. But even after the commission's report was submitted in March 2015, which made clear that there had been, it was in effect a policing disaster. Basically, the SAPS has done very little to address the legacy of Marikana.
All right, David Bruce, we're going to leave that conversation there. Thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. Independent researcher and writer David Bruce, who specializes in crime and policing, as well as a former member of the Marikana Panel of Experts, just chatting to us about the latest regarding the Marikana Commission recommendations, 8 years as we remember that massacre.